Welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision, and philosophy define our contemporary world. The program is privileged to have two distinguished American poets, William Meredith and Richard Herteis. Welcome to the program. Will you tell us what brings you to India?
Well, about 21 years ago, William was first here. He came on a similar tour with the United States Information Service, and he also went to Yugoslavia and to Israel. It was a kind of a package thing. And I wasn't with William at that time, but it was he was writing me wonderful letters about having visited the Jane Bird Hospital and different things that he had done here. And it seemed like a wonderful country. And it's a country I've always wanted to visit. It has the cliche is the mother of religions and the great sort of things that have gone on here, this ancient civilization. My little sister had come here on her own at one point and came back changed. Another cliche, but it's true. She had been kind of drifting and then came back and became a psychotherapist and married and had children. So it's a country I've always, from my hippie youth, have wished to visit. And William, having been here already, at 2 winters ago, we were sitting there thinking, where shall we go? You know, what shall we do now that William's in a kind of retirement? And we thought of India. So it's a kind of sentimental journey, a kind of return for William, and for me, a kind of first time to... I had done a book called Marathon, which is about training and running the New York City Marathon. I did that at a kind of midlife crisis when I was years into caregiving for William, and that was sort of the physical coming back. But I'm doing a book now, which is... I hope will be a kind of spiritual journey as well. And I've stolen the title Passage to India. You can't copyright a title. That's a working title. Friends have said it won't do. So.
Well, William was sort of saying that you feel, William, that this is second home for you in some senses?
Slightly second home, but very fascinated land. India is a remarkable country, and deep inside, I'm feeling for that, you know.
When you were a teacher, and that was a sort of important part and process of your life for many years.
Yes.
And
Princeton and Hawaii, but Connecticut College, 30 years, 29.
And you were a sort of a wordsmith. And of course, sort of, you know, when you write poetry, it's you internalize words in some ways. Did you find that, you know, the stroke and what it did to you, and in what ways has it affected your work?
I think the main thing is powerful language. Little by little, I learn it, and 62 years ago, and stroke inhibited me, but I like it anyway because a powerful language, and I'm difficult to say, but more and more I say things correctly again.
If I can help answer that question, I think it's, I'm rather proud that William won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award after his stroke. So putting poems together was a kind of therapy for William, and for me too. And now these were poems which had been previously written, but maybe in one of 17 versions, maybe not published, maybe never brought to a book before, something of this order. Sometimes we went back to journal entries. He was traveling once with Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior under President Kennedy, and has a wonderful little journal entry about their doing the Whitewater tour. Stewart was fond of taking friends like Jackie Kennedy, so went down the Whitewaters, and he wrote a little sonnet about the moon there. And so we took the journal entry and the sonnet and put that together as a kind of a new work. So it's been a kind of collage, if you wish, but that's an art form too. I think the wonderful thing about poetry is that it has a life of its own. That, you know, it's still going out to Mars.
Right.
It has a life. The words continue to live. And so William can recoup those words now.
So you go back to your poetry that you've written earlier. Do you sort of draw sustenance from it?
Really, no. Frost and Eliot and Tate and other people, but not myself. Over and done with it now.
That's not true.
I know. When this happened, William was the poetry consultant at the Library of Congress, which job became the Poet Laureate of the United States later on. Up till then, a number of poets felt that this was a kind of undemocratic institution. We didn't want our poets writing poems for the Queen's dog or something. But I was saying this morning, there were a number of Southern senators Anglophiles who just had to have a Poet Laureate, so they had one. And William, then all the living ones were made Poet Laureate retroactively by a law that was passed. And I went to the Librarian of Congress and I said, could I have the introductions that William did when he was in that post? Because William was very fastidious about introductions. It wasn't just, here he is. I mean, there were little mini essays on the individual writer, and there were people like Toni Morrison that he first brought there, and John Irving, and other writers who had become important in our, Robert Pinsky, who's the current Poet Laureate, and so forth. So there were great introductions, and whenever I play them, he's really he's there. So he loves watching himself, and I think that they've been good therapy too. I mean, you could say a few poems if you wanted to have a couple.
Yes, that would be terrific.
How about a major work? You could say that poem easily.
A major work. Poems are hard to read. Pictures are hard to see. Music is hard to hear. And people are hard to love. But whether from brute need or divine energy, at last eye, mind, and ear, and the great sloth heart will move.
Poems are hard to read. Are they difficult to write? Are they hard to write? You write very few poems at a time, so it's 6 poems a year. Is it hard to write?
Inspiration. I don't know why that is. Sometimes trees and poetry, students and poetry, and now students and trees, and then poetry high up. I don't know why that is, but something very specific happens to me, and I live with it always.
William he had a farm and a great tree lover, so I think students and poetry and trees were the tripartite soul of William Meredith. And I think that he wasn't one of these ivory tower poets who lived only for poetry, but he felt really that a person had to be engaged in the real world, and that this is where poems came from. But if you'd indulge me, this is an interview that William gave 2 weeks before his stroke, and he answers this very question. Just quickly, you've said that the average about so many poems, why so few? William says, why so many? Ask any reviewer. I remember a particularly wicked review of Edna St. Vincent Millay, whose new poems weren't as good as they should have been. This Millay seems to have gone out of her way to write another book of poems. You're always afraid of that. That could be said, I believe, of certain people's poems. So I wait until the poems seem to be addressed not to occupant, but to William Meredith. And it doesn't happen a lot. I think if I had a great deal more time, it would happen more often because I would get immediately to the typewriter. But it might happen 8 times a year instead of 6, not much more than that. I'll say this because it may be interesting or important. I think it is because poetry and experience should have an exact ratio. Astonishing experience doesn't happen very often. Daily experience is astonishing on a level at which you can write a poem, but astonishing experience would be the experience which is not astonishment of reality, but astonishment of insight. It is for me, as a lyric poet, to make poems only out of insights that I encounter. Robert Frost used to say, how many things have to happen to you before something occurs to you?
You mentioned this aspect of astonishment, of insight. You described yourself as a bee poet. That's your own description of yourself. That isn't the community's sort of response to you. You're very highly regarded. But what do you feel that you lack that you describe yourself as a bee poet? Or is it just sort of the underlying modesty in much of your work that prompts you to say that?
10 or 12 poems, A minus, but B plus all rest. Because Auden is better, and Frost is better poets. And I salute them for it.
You've also sort of written and talked about the usefulness of poetry. We tend to sort of think of poetry as something somewhat, well, I hate to use the word indulgent, but for the elite, for academics and intellectuals and people with a certain sensitivity. What is the use of poetry?
Use, because poetry is matter of fact, but high up also.
So do you see a kind of a priestly, spiritual quality to poetry when you say it's high up?
No, not really. Things are a goddess or God, I can't say which, very high up. And I think poetry, 10 days only in a year, you know?
10 in a year. This concept, I've heard William talk about what useful means, and I think it goes back to this not being an elitist poet, but that I think William really wanted to have a lot of people read the work, that was important, not for an egotistical basis, but that people would find something in it that would be helpful. And again, not that you sort of preach, or it's not a pedagogy, but that somehow people would find it useful or important in their lives, and common people as well. And I think William's diction, for example, is similar to Frost, and that's very colloquial. There are no 50-cent words there, you know, it's these abstractions and so forth. Yet there are profundities, for sure, and it's not a cheap optimism either. I mean, I think William's aware of the dark underbelly of life, but nevertheless, he remains cheer. He has a poem called The Cheer. The cheer, reader, my friends, is in the words somewhere. Frankly, I'd like to make you smile. Words addressing evil won't turn evil back, but they will give heart. And I think this is one aspect of how William sees his poetry, is giving heart. He has a series of poems called Hazard the Painter. It's an imaginary playmate who's married with children and middle-class American artist. And he says, let the young be as uncanny as they wish. Hazard just naturally thinks it's a good bind to be in. So he's kind of at home in the world, and it's very unfashionable.
You know, let the young be uncanny as they wish, and you've been a teacher. Do you sort of, do you despair? How do you respond to sort of change? Change in society, change in culture, moral values, the change in the media, the way the sort of the cultural landscape of the young is changing?
I like it, but I can't little bit difficult for me because very hard words. 25 years old man and woman. But I love it too. So somewhere along the line, a poet too, 81 years old, but a poet also.
When you describe yourself as an 81-year-old poet, apart from sort of the writing of poetry, what is a sensibility that is unique to a poet as an artist, as opposed to, say, a musician or a novelist?
I have a very hard question. I think the poet is one time only 50 lines of poetry, 500 lines of prose. And very often, two poems, two essays, novels, two novels.
Well, short stories that you wrote.
Short stories. Very bad.
No, they were good. They were. Williams wrote two short stories. He's saying.
Yeah, but
tried it, but
the hind legs.
You were like a dog standing on its hind legs.
Yes.
Like a circus dog, you were just performing tricks.
Yeah.
It wasn't your sensibility.
Yeah, I'm very interested in two.
They're good short stories, but
yeah, but
we have a friend who used to describe. There's this cliche about real toads in an imaginary garden. The shape of William's mind is very strange. I think that to look at that retina, he has a very odd way of seeing things that you don't normally see. And for my money, that's what this metaphorical vision, where it's another cliche, but you look at the moon, you see a tangerine or something, where you're putting these associations together. Even after his stroke, we had a wonderful yellow lab that died, but he was very old, and once William caught him kind of jerking in his sleep, the way dogs would do, and William looked at him and he said, "Rabbits, big as a house." So it's that way of kind of seeing. And I think also with William, he was this sort of little production. I think that there were mysteries that William, questions that he was trying to figure out in his poetry. And he may have sort of thought of things for several years before he would maybe come to an answer. So there was a kind of philosophical taking something on and then playing with the language and somehow letting the language, we say form and content can't be separate. So as you work the language, that you discover the answer maybe to your question in that. And William was far better at that kind of revision than I.
It's one of sort of the appeals of poetry, this aspect of mystery, that you only have a few words that are evocative, and there are these sort of various interpretations that we give to them, depending on what resonances they strike in us. This aspect of mystery, how important is that to you? Is the process of writing poetry a catharsis, giving definition, form to that mystery?
Well, 10 days only, I live other world, and then other lives, level. So I don't know why that is, but something I think is a very hard, difficult thing, and I think also uh, difficult because very also grand, and then suddenly, thump, it is gone.
Richard, you've been with William for 27 years. In what ways has his sort of life and poetry impacted you and your work?
I'm happy to say and sad to say a great deal.
Why sad?
When I first met William, I was a long-haired hippie, and he was sort of a shorter, long-haired hippie, and I admired some stands that he took at this writers' conference, which had sort of fallen apart because the forces didn't want all the structure and all of that, and I had a novel. I was just back from the Peace Corps, and I had written it in the first person, and he sort of really said, no, please try to write it in the third person, get some distance from it, and make it a creative, imaginative piece, and you'll be better for it. And I said, no, that's a persona, it's not really me, and of course it was me, and he even offered to redo the book for me, and just as an experiment. I said, no, I don't want to be influenced by anybody, thank you. And of course it's still collecting dust, that book, because I should have taken him up on it when I had the chance. And I don't know, it was unwise of me. I'm a kind of orphan in a way. I don't read as much as I should, and I haven't, my style is one that I've kind of organic, and it's come. And I would have done better, but over the years, when you hear William read these wonderful poems, even phrases, and so my work became a kind of dialogue with William in some respects. A number of these poems were written for or to me, and many of mine back. And there was one book called Internal Geography, which was a sad book, but nevertheless it was a kind of grieving process, and there were a lot of poems which sort of just talked about where I was, where he was, and what it meant, and so forth. So the lives have intersected, and the language has intersected as well. I have a poem called Gibbous, in fact, in which it's that gibbous phase of the moon, sort of 3/4 full, and that 3/4 meant, well, I hope it's not. I hope we're only at half stage at age 53. But I'm thinking about where I am in my life at that point, and I take phrases of William's poems, which have come from our friendship and respond to those, for example. So it's a lot, and he's not exactly Mother Teresa, but it's fun to. It's been very interesting to see the kind of courage that William's had on a day-to-day basis to sort of hang in there and do the awful things, when other illnesses come and so forth. And
what ways do you think he's impacted your life? Beyond sort of, looking after you and that sort of the physical presence and support, which is obviously...
A beautiful man, a beautiful poet, and very... I love him very much.
That's pretty good, William. That's pretty good. Also, when they used to say never trust anybody over 30, and I was kind of radical, and there were certain poems about William. He grew up and had friends with Warren and the New Critics and that kind of formal structure, and he has an aristocratic background and all of that. And I'm a middle-class boy from Pennsylvania, and so we were sort of a little different. And there were times in his work where I thought it got a little stuffy. He wrote a poem once called "A Mild-Spoken Citizen Finally Writes to the White House," and this poem was. I thought a little pretentious. A little cheeky to be, although I agreed with what he was saying. I think it was about the Watergate period and asking Mr. Nixon to please respect the ghosts of the House and pay attention. There have been other people there who've taken on this challenge, and you should too, But so I think there's that I was kind of I was a young Turk, kind of at his heels very often about different things. But we did actually look at each other's works and just sort of review it that way.
25 years old, you know. Whippersnapper.
I was a young whippersnapper.
Richard, that was sort of when I was looking at these poems, and as an Indian, you immediately strike a reference to something, anything Indian, and you have these words. We had the lucky chance of seeing you, a householder and ascetic both. We drove through the green mountains hour after hour, like making a pilgrimage to Ganesha. the elephant-headed god and the beloved Mother Saraswati, goddess of music and learning, and goes on. And there's a reference to the Bhagavad Gita, and how has sort of Indian philosophy in some ways influenced you?
This poem was written for Srila Ray. Srila is the title of the poem. She was have we talked to her? A beautiful Indian woman who, she came to the Breadloaf Writers Conference where William was teaching with a Roman Catholic nun as her chaperone. Mm-hmm. And this was a very curious thing for all the American kids, you know, to see.
And Indian robes.
In the sari and all this. And she was a very beautiful woman, and she married a Dutch-American guy, and they had 2 kids, nice kids. One boy's a theologian now, and the other is still in school. But she had lung disease, and she died. But she was a dear friend of ours, and she taught us a lot. You know, she was very interested in sort of third world causes. She was always on our backs about have you seen this about the Palestinians and so forth. And so she was really a kind of a window into not just India for us. And she loved William, and so we often visited her, and she was a really good friend, and that's what this poem's about.
You know, a poet's sort of sensibility, looking at the mysteries of life and the larger sort of the universe, the cosmos, and the more subtle nuances of life. Do you contemplate, do you ever think of death? Does that figure in your imagination? Do you fear it? Do you welcome it? Do you are indifferent to it?
Indifferent, I think. I go to the rave somewhere, but not now. Not now. Life is good to me now. Very interesting place. Frost said 3 moons is better than 1, but I say 1 because everything is enormously interesting anyway.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's been a great pleasure. And William.